the same time, Judah's economy was developing, and this small kingdom became a genuine state. 1 century after the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the king of Judah, Josiah, took advantage of the decline of the Assyrian Empire to envisage the conquest of the territories in the north. The refugees from the kingdom of the north brought with them their traditions and religions. However, Josiah's plan was based on a united people, a single nation. Josiah's plan was carried out in steps. First of all, he discovered a book that was attributed to Moses and united the population around the laws it contained. Leaving aside the historicity of this event, it is believed that the book in question was the 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy.
One of the most important ideas in the book of Deuteronomy is the idea of the centralization of the cult. And it says that all the people of Israel must worship one God and one God only in one place. So it's one nation worshiping one God in a single temple.
The second step of the reform involved eradicating any competing religions in order to unite the people around a single God. Finally, the third step involved elaborating a common history by combining the traditions of the North with those of the South. Is it possible to find traces in the field of Josiah's reform, proof that this centralization of religion in Jerusalem occurred? The Temple of Arad in the Negev, constructed in the 8th century BC, is located inside a fortress. The temple was destroyed at the end of the 8th century and was never rebuilt. It was constructed on the model of temples that had been erected in Canaan for centuries, a model going back to the late Bronze Age. In the internal courtyard, which was open to the public, we find the sacrificial area. The courtyard gives on to a sanctuary reserved for priests only. Beyond that, the Holy of Holies, with 2 altars and 2 vertical stones, representing what the Bible enigmatically calls the Matzevah. This temple is a place of worship like those that existed outside of Jerusalem in the 8th century.
If what we think about this temple is correct, we have a very interesting situation of a difference between the 8th and 7th centuries BC. In the 8th century, we have temples in various places in Judah, including this one of Arad behind me, Beersheba, which is not far from here, and other places. Whereas in the 7th century, they all disappear. And we have the temple in Jerusalem.
The Bible sets out Josiah's declaration to the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. We will now turn to one element of the story, which is based on a book.
The fact that they said a book had been found, which means that it was an ancient book that was lost somewhere in the temple, obviously legitimated the reform. But at the same time, it also shows that the redefinition of the Judaite religion was now going to be based on a book. The book was going to become the basis of a new religion. So it's not just the fact that a book was found, but there's the whole issue of the status and importance of that book, which it didn't have before.
In order to pursue our investigation, we have to examine a central question, that of writing. What do we know about the beginnings of writing in this region? In which circumstances did writing become important in the society of ancient Israel? Did the Israelites know how to read and write in the 7th century BC? Here again, we have to look to archaeology for the answers. In the 7th century sites, we have discovered many seals and ostraka, fragments of pottery that contain inscriptions. In the 8th century, they are very rare. Before that, they are quite simply non-existent. These brief texts deal with economic or administrative questions. Written by scribes, they provide evidence of the development and centralization of Judah, which was then an Assyrian vassal. This corresponds to a well-known phenomenon. The emergence of a state is generally accompanied by the spread of writing. In an ostracon of the 7th century, a laborer complains to the authorities about the theft of a garment. In what way does this text provide proof of a revolution?
Before the 7th century BC, it's clear that the ancient Israelites were not literate. As a matter of fact, what we would say is that literacy wasn't even a category that people thought about. It wasn't an important idea in society. Beginning in the 7th century, writing spreads through all classes of Israelite society. We see writing by tomb cutters, by officers in the army, by workmen. A variety of different kinds of people throughout society are writing and apparently reading as well. And the spread of writing in ancient Israel at this time indicates that writing at least had a beginnings of literacy in Israel. And of course, this beginnings of literacy will be critical to the emergence of a sacred, written, and authoritative text.
Writing had just expanded beyond the circle of scribes. Of course, public readings of the book discovered in the temple do not prove the degree of literacy of the population of Judah. But they do show the function that the written word had attained in 7th century society. In the small state of Judah, under the reign of Josiah, a revolution had been launched.
The fact that a sacred written text emerged from a pastoral agrarian society is a watershed of Western civilization. Never before in human history had societies had sacred texts that were authoritative. Most Near Eastern civilizations had texts only for governments, for writing. Authority, cultural authority, religious authority was passed from family to family through oral tradition. It wasn't passed by reading texts or appealing to the authority of text. The first time in human history that we have the authority of human texts is with the Josianic religious reforms, where they appeal to the authority of a written text and have that written text as a binding authority for the entire culture, for all people, as opposed to the authority of the family and the tradition. And this is a watershed of Western civilization.
In the 7th century BC, everything merges. Everything is ripe for something new. when we look at the politics of the time, the economy of the time, the social situation in Judah, even the fact that literacy spreads from the center to the countryside, to the villages, to the relatively simple people, what we see is a situation in which Judah puts everything in the written word, in a book. Judah describes its past, mythical or historical. It tells us about the present, and it gives us the dreams for the future in the shape of the written word, of a book. And this is something new in the history of the human adventure.
Based on this legitimacy founded on a common law and history, Josiah was able to lead the population in his ambitious plan. But the dream of a great kingdom that would unite the people of Israel and Judah for the first time ever was not to be. Josiah died before he was able to accomplish it, killed by Pharaoh Necho II. His end is related in the Bible in a few lines. And the worst was yet to come. In 597 BC, the Babylonians wreaked havoc in the kingdom of Judah for the first time. "11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem. The temple of Yahweh was burned down. Jerusalem was laid to ruins. Judah was erased from the map." A significant portion of the rural population was maintained in Judah under the yoke of Babylonia. In line with imperial policy, some of the inhabitants were exiled to Babylon. The last king of the house of David, Zedekiah, was also exiled, his sons slaughtered. The elite of the cities, the priests and the scribes, were banished to the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The book of Psalms laments that, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept."
The situation of exile is in fact a situation of huge crisis because all the pillars on which the identity of a people were based no longer existed. There was no more temple, there was no more king, there was no more country, there was no more territorial unity. So in order to survive, it was necessary to find other means of constructing an identity. It was in fact those who were exiled, the scribes, the priests, who constructed that identity, taking up a certain number of earlier traditions, but opening those traditions out. That is, Josiah's reform would become the symbol of the temple, which was transformed into a synagogue. Little by little, Moses would replace the king, and the Torah would replace the country. Through this work of writing and rewriting, Judaism would be invented in the concrete form that it took during the Persian era, notably under Ezra the priest.
Biblical scholars have therefore suggested that the scribe Ezra gave the final touches to the Torah, the Pentateuch. We are approaching our conclusion. What have we learned from the evidence provided by the mounds, the broken vases, and the ancient inscriptions? We are at the theology department of the University of Lausanne. Israel Finkelstein is going to meet with Thomas Romer.
Thomas, I wanted to ask you a question.
The time when archaeologists took the Bible literally and when textual research ignored material evidence is past.
But I'm asking you about the heroic stories. In 2 Samuel 21, in 2 Samuel, and for you, has these new revelations of archaeology, have they changed something?
I think we have to distinguish between the final form of the Bible, which has become the basis not only of Judaism, but for the three monotheistic religions, and the origins of the Hebrew Bible. What I think is important is this question of origins. It's no longer about the wanderings of Abraham or David. The most significant change is the realization that there was a political will at work at the origins. Let me turn your question around. How do you see the Hebrew Bible? How would you define it?
In a way, I started feeling closer to the authors of the text because I sensed more their needs and their frustrations and their the problems that they faced and so on. So first of all, I would say that I feel closer to the text, and it gave me a better sense of my own identity, both as an Israeli and as a Jew, and also as a member of the wider community, you can call it Western civilization or Judeo-Christian or whatever. So on both sides.
For many years, our only knowledge of the Bible came from the Bible itself. But modern archaeology has suggested a new approach, an attempt to understand the stories of the Bible in terms of their political, geographical, historical, and cultural contexts. What was at stake when the biblical text was put into writing was the invention of a lineage, the establishment of a law, and the affirmation of a messianic promise. All of that was linked to a book which, in exile, became a portable nation, a land that could be copied, studied, passed on, and celebrated. This day of the Jewish calendar is called Simchat Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, or celebration of the book. As a result of events that were not foreseen by the protagonists, these pillars would become the foundation of Judaism. But that is another story. The sun rises over the lands of Canaan, lands where, according to the Bible, lived the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Our investigation is about to begin, at the beginning. Their stories are told in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Israel Finkelstein, a researcher at the Archaeology Institute of the University of Tel Aviv, has had joint charge of excavations in Megiddo in the north of Israel for almost 10 years. About 100 specialists and volunteers from all over the world are involved in this undertaking. Megiddo is the jewel of biblical archaeology. Its history. The Israelites' long sojourn in Egypt, their enslavement and liberation, and the law received by Moses represent the core of the second book of the Bible. The Bible tells us that under the leadership of this exceptional man, Moses, the Hebrew people returned to the land that had been promised to their ancestors. Our investigation will begin in Lausanne, in the library of the theology department to be exact. Thomas Romer is a biblical scholar. He will be accompanying us in our investigation of these texts. In order to understand the role played by Egypt in the Bible, we have to go back to the circumstances surrounding the arrival of Jacob's sons in that country.
Egypt is omnipresent in the Hebrew Bible. It is often a land of welcome. Abraham went there because of the famine in Canaan, as did Jacob and his son Joseph later on. It was also a land